being recorded is I just want to talk about sperm again and why it's not human. So I want to kind of review this video. So let's listen to this. So actually,
Spoiler alert.
that was a so there's a previous video that I made where I covered why a Turner syndrome female is proof that how a Turner syndrome female shows, right, accidentally that males are not human. Yeah, and here is further proof of that because of what is going on with the Y itself, right? Because of what, so you have to understand how things work, which is that the biology is biology, and then there are going to be consequences of this biology, and the Turner syndrome female is a consequence of that. Is a consequence of the biology that is biology that with the presence of a non-human organism in a human, appearing as a human organism. Turner syndrome female is a consequence of that, right? But it is a consequence that reveals, that is a window into what actually happened. So let's review what
Turns
we
out
went
the
through.
Y chromosome is just as weird as we always thought it was. Because after decades and decades of Human Genome Project, genetic mapping revealed that the sequence here is just not really what anyone expected. The complete sequence of human Y chromosome revealed that it's just weird. No better word to describe it. But not like alien weird or like, oh my god, biology is wrong weird. More like it just doesn't really make sense in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different structures. But anyway, a wonderful person. This is
No, actually, it is kind of like alien weird. Okay. So the reason he's saying that it was weird is because they had already mapped the entire human genome. Okay. They have mapped out all the chromosomes that are human, which would be the 46 chromosomes of the female. They have mapped those out. I mean, their intent was to map out the entire human genome, right, including the Y. And this is from the context of they believe that the Y is also human, right? So that is their point of view, which is that they want to map out the entire human chromosomes, human genome, right? And which means all the chromosomes, right? But what ended up happening was they established a they established a pattern of which the human chromosomes follow. Yeah, they established a pattern which the human chromosomes follow. And what ended up happening, the reason they're saying that it is weird is because the Y chromosome does not follow that pattern. So let me rephrase what just happened. Okay. So they have a sense of what human chromosomes look like, the human genome looks like. Yeah. And I'm here telling you, no, this Y chromosome is not human, right? And then when they finally sequenced it, they're saying that it doesn't match what the human chromosomes have established themselves to be. Ooh, 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 ooh. The Y chromosome doesn't follow the sequence that the rest of the human chromosome have have been discovered to follow, which means that the entire human genome, right? All the other chromosomes, they follow a human pattern. The Y chromosome does not follow that pattern, which is exactly what you would expect if it is not human. Yeah, if you would. The reason you can know what is a gorilla genome versus a human genome is because they have different patterns. So how can you say that something that has a different pattern must also be human when the other ones, every single one of them follow the same pattern. That you have to understand that the assumption that this Y chromosome is human is what is causing all of them to miss these signs. And the reason I didn't miss it is because I never had that assumption. I had to throw out that assumption. The reason I didn't miss it is because I threw out that assumption, because I went back to what would it look like? What would things look like if we were actually looking at the default, that if we didn't know what we were looking at, yeah, if we didn't know what we were looking at, if there was no assumption that anyone is this or anyone is that, including which one is female, which one is human, and which one is not. I threw out that it was even females who are humans. I threw out that it was males who are human. I threw out that either one was human. And I went back to what would it look like? How would we know which one of them is human? And the X chromosome, the Turner syndrome female, is how you know, because the X chromosome only has a female version, and that is the human essence. Because there is no Y-O, because the X chromosome, before you ever even get to making a Y-O, right? The cell, right? The cell has to have an X chromosome or it dies. That means that the ovum, the X cell has to have a human essence. It has to have a species essence, or it even dies. The cell has to have a species essence that is original to it, or it dies. It has to have a species essence, or it dies. The blueprint, that means that the X is the blueprint, it's also the life. The life is in the species itself, and that is in the X chromosome. And when I was studying all of this, I realized that if you were going to say that the Y chromosome was human, it doesn't follow any pattern of such things. It doesn't follow any pattern. That if you didn't know what you were looking at, and you were just saying, okay, you know what? Let's just, we don't know, let's say like you're kind of like an alien. You're an alien, right? You are an alien, so you don't know what the human genome is even look like. You don't know what the human genome is look like, and then you have to pick out which ones are the human genome, right? You have to pick them out. What you're going to do is you are going to follow the ones who follow the same pattern. It's okay, this looks like it's human, this looks like it's human, and this looks like it's human, and this looks like it's human. And when you're done with all of that, and then what you will do is you will exclude the Y because it doesn't follow the pattern. You would have excluded the Y because it doesn't follow the pattern. And what you will have ended up was that only the female was human. That's how I did not miss it. Because the assumption that simply because it appears human, right? And therefore it must be, that is what is screwing up all these scientists. Right? So let's do that again. Let's say that you're studying fruit flies, right? You go studying fruit flies, and you, of course, you being human, you don't know what the heck would a fruit fly genome look like unless somebody tells you, right? So let's say that you're conducting an experiment to say, you know what, let's see what, out of here, right? Out of all of this, which ones are fruit fly genome, right? And you get a pattern of this is the X chromosome, right? This is the X chromosome because that is the fruit, the fly, the fruit fly, what do you call it? The essence, the fruit fly essence. That's what that is, right? Let's say you were giving just X chromosome as a blueprint of what to look for, as what the how to identify which chromosomes belong to this particular fruit fly organism, right? Okay. So what you're going to do, you're going to take that X. You're going to take that X that you were given, but it's not going to be a human X. You're not going to know that it's a human X. You will assume that it is a fly. It is the fly's X. So you would take that, right? You would take that and you would go through the genome that you were given, right? All the chromosomes that you were given. And you will mark them and say, okay, so this follows this pattern, therefore it must be in the same family as this, right? It follows this pattern, it must in, and therefore it must be in the same family. It follows this pattern, therefore it must be in the same family. And when you're done with that, what you will have done is you will have left off the Y chromosome, because you would never be able to guess that it is not, right? It is human. You would never be able to guess that it is fine, because it looks different. You will have died on that hill. You will have bet your life that it is not of the fly. It is not part of the fly's genome, because it looked different. And the way you will have been able to ID that is that the genome will have the same pattern. The genome would have the same pattern. That's how you would know. You were supposed to have the same pattern. And the Y is the only one. Let me tell you something. Out of all the 47 chromosomes, right? The Y is the only one that is different. And I'm saying 47 chromosomes because the females have 46 chromosomes and the males have 46 chromosomes. But the X and the Y are two different chromosomes. So if you're going to say that the males are human, you will have to count the Y as a 47 chromosome. So there are 47 different types of chromosomes in the entire human genome, except that one of them is masquerading. One of them is not, in fact, human. That's why they're saying that it is weird.
And today we're going to be discussing some of the new discoveries about the Y chromosome, and also discuss another study in regards to animals that have lost their Y chromosome and in some sense are still surviving just fine. And so we're also going to try to answer the question of,
now again, the reason the animals would survive just fine is because, right, they never needed a Y. They never needed a Y at all.
are humans losing Y chromosome, and what's going to happen to humans when there is no Y left around? And so let's discuss this in a little bit more detail, but I guess let's start with the obvious. Human Genome Project, even though it's technically finished, is not finished. Despite a lot of different mapping that's already taken place, and despite solid understanding of what's happening in our genes, there are still a lot of secrets left here, and still a lot of unanswered questions, including questions about junk DNA. Now that's something we'll talk about in some of the other videos, but there are still some things here that we still do not understand completely. And one chromosome that was particularly challenging to map turned out to be the Y chromosome, the smallest of them all. And so even though a few years ago in the video in the description I've discussed some of the recent details and some of the recent discoveries about the Human Genome Project, it took a few more years and additional techniques to finally finish everything, including the Y chromosome. The chromosome that, unlike other chromosomes, doesn't actually contain that many genes. Its main purpose is to determine birth sex in humans and other similar mammals.
No, that's not what it's doing at all. That is not what it is doing. Okay, I don't know how they're coming. I mean, I kind of get why they're coming up with this, but I am just astounded as to how much they actually lost. Okay, how much they actually missed. No, if you look at the the signaling pathway of how the Y is activated, of how the sex is, sex happens, right? It is not choosing a sex. Let me repeat that. It is not choosing a sex, because the sex is already predetermined as female, always female. That means that when the Y activates, right, it is interrupting the development of the female. It is not sex choosing. Choosing would be, the X, the X is, how should I say this? The X is just blank. The X is blank, right? Choosing would be that the X is blank because it is the one that actually starts off the organism. It is the one that starts off the organism, right? So the X would be blank. It wouldn't be female. it would just be blank. It would be a blank slate, male or female, right? Right? And then it would tell it to change to. Then it would tell it to choose male. It would tell it to choose equally male or female. It would tell it equally male or female. Again, it would tell it equally male or female. If the Y chromosome was choosing a sex, it would tell it male or female. That means that it would be able to become female as well. Let me repeat that. If the Y chromosome was choosing the sex, the X would be blank. It wouldn't have an innate sex already, which means the Y chromosome would be able to turn both both female and male. Okay? So because, and the reason, even though, and the reason, my problem right now is how do I make you believe that what I'm saying is actually what is correct versus what they are saying, right? Because what they're saying, it sounds correct because that is what we experience gender as, right? That is what we experience gender as, male or female, right? But you don't understand that the way life works, not just biology, the way life works is that if something is a choice, right? If something is making you choose something, that means inherently the thing to be chosen in the first place must first be blank and not inherent of something else, and not already inherent of one thing, right? For instance, let's say like a woman, gives birth, right? Because it is inherent in her to have given that birth. The child would normally go with her. So that's like saying the child chose to go with its mother. So when she takes the child home, right? That would be like saying the hospital let her take the child. You understand, right? The hospital chose where the child is gonna go. That's kind of like that. Again, let me repeat that. So because the child is inherent to the woman, they say, and then when the hospital let her take her child, that's like saying the hospital chose the child to go home. That's what they're saying. Let me show you another thing, right? Dubai, let's say, iPhones. And iPhones typically come black, right? They typically come black. So because the blackness is inherent to it, yeah? When they say the blackness is inherent to it, and then you paint it white, yeah? And then you paint it white. That is like saying that you chose a white iPhone. Oh, you hear that, right? That is like saying you chose a white iPhone. Opposed to, right? As opposed to you chose a white paint. Do you understand? As opposed to you chose a white paint. I mean, that is an example. If white, and then it was, I think it was later that they actually came up with, white iPhones, and now it's kind of like black and white. Yeah. So that's like saying that. That's like saying that you chose a white iPhone. You did not choose a white iPhone, right? You chose a white paint. When it comes to iPhones, you only had one choice. The choice was already inherent. So you didn't choose a white iPhone. You cannot choose a white iPhone. Let me give you an example. Another example, right? Refrigerators, right? For a long time, before refrigerators started having the chrome color, right? They only came in white. Yeah? They only came in white. But I'm sure people were altering them like they always did. People were altering them in every color. that would actually be exactly like the iPhone example, right? So that would be like someone coming to your house and saying, "Oh, you chose a turquoise refrigerator. Well, you couldn't choose a turquoise refrigerator because they simply did not exist, right? You chose a paint because the choice that you had was on the paint level, right? Was on the paint level, but not on the refrigerator level because the whiteness was already inherent to the refrigerator. Makes sense? Yeah.
And so if the
So the Y is not choosing. The Y is not choosing. If it was choosing, the X would be blank. The X would not be default female. The X would not be the X would not be default female. The Y is not choosing. The Y is interrupting what is occurring naturally and interrupting it's hijacking that which occurs naturally into to create something that does not occur naturally, which is the the case of the turquoise color on the refrigerator. The whiteness of the refrigerator is something that is inherent in refrigerators back then. So you choosing a turquoise paint, you choosing to paint it a turquoise paint, that is you interrupting something that is not inherent to the refrigerator, right? That is not inherent to you. That is you changing something that is inherent to the fridge. You are interrupting the inherentness of the whiteness, right? There is no choice for you to have a turquoise refrigerator.
embryo acquires X and Y chromosomes, it technically becomes male because it contains a trigger known as SRY gene.
Okay, so he's about to describe to you exactly what I just said, which is that the Y is hijacking it by instigating a signaling process that is different from what is innate to the X.
Sex determining region Y protein, that sort of looks like this, that's responsible for switching on so-called male genes on other chromosomes. One of the most important one is known as SOX9 gene.
Okay, so he kind of described it, but the way he said it, as though it was it was inherent again, like as though it was inherent, right? As though there is a choice of, as though there is the X is blank, and then there is a choice of male or female switches. No, it's not. That is not what happens. There is no female switch because it is already inherently female. There is no female switch because it is already inherent female. You do not have to switch on the female. The female is already always there, which means that what is happening is that the Y is killing the female by hijacking it. The Y is killing the female process by hijacking it. It is a hijacking that is happening. It is a theft that is happening. It's not switching on the genes, right? It is not switching on the genes, right? It's not switching them on.
The gene responsible for the development of testes. But this can be activated by other genes in other animals, and so technically this SOX9 gene, the gene responsible for the development of testes. But this can be activated by other genes in other animals, and so technically this particular protein is not really required, but it seems to be pretty efficient, and that's why Y chromosome became sort of the feature a lot of different mammals acquired. Although none of this seemed to have became sort of the feature a lot of different mammals acquired. Although none of this seemed to have existed approximately 150 million years ago. Back then, X and Y were just ordinary chromosomes, the way they are.
Okay, now let's talk about that because he just said something that's very significant. That fits exactly into what I'm saying, right? I'm saying that they were different organisms, which means in a different organism, right? In your in your body, those sex chromosomes, even though we call them sex chromosomes, they're not actually sex chromosomes. They are just your chromosomes. They are just ordinary chromosomes. Again, let me repeat that. They are calling it sex chromosomes, but they are not actually sex chromosomes. They are species chromosomes. They are just to you chromosomes. And that's exactly what they are. So let's say you take a bacteria. Let's say you take a bacteria, for instance, right? A bacteria organism, which is a unicellular organism and doesn't engage in sexual reproduction, although it shares genes with other bacteria, right? But they do not actually reproduce sexually. Yeah, even though they would like to tell you that what happens is sexual reproduction. That's not what they're doing. They are sharing genes to optimize themselves, which means that they share their genes, they share the genes, and then they use the genes to better themselves, right? And it is the genes that they've cleaned up and used it to better themselves, and then they reproduce, and their progeny then inherits those new genes. But it's not sexual reproduction. It's not reproducing by sharing the genes, right? So let's take a bacteria, for instance. Let's say that they have these chromosomes, right? And they have the genes, and let's assume that their genes. Let's assume that their genes are in these chromosomes that we're talking about, right? To them, because they don't reproduce sexually, yeah. To them, the chromosomes would simply be just normal chromosomes. It wouldn't be anything called sex chromosomes. That is what I mean. It wouldn't be anything called sex chromosomes. And in each organism, the male, female, when they were apart, right? When they were not, quote unquote, the same organism, the same species, right? They were just chromosomes. Those supposedly sex chromosomes were just chromosomes. That's exactly what he was saying.
Today, in for example birds. Birds don't have the same sex chromosomes as us. And there used to be 2 copies of the Y chromosome that contained approximately 1000 genes as well. But it's believed that around this time, this is when SRI gene evolved, and that's when this protein became extremely efficient at activating sex genes. And at this point, the Y chromosome started to change quite dramatically. Various types of mutations point this way. But it's believed that around this time, this is when SRI gene evolved, and that's when this protein became extremely efficient at activating sex genes. And at this point, the Y chromosome started to change quite dramatically. Various types of mutations, and there used to be 2 copies of the Y chromosome that contained approximately 1000 genes as well. But it's believed that around this time, this is when SRI gene evolved, and that's when this protein became extremely efficient at activating sex genes. And at this
so you have to understand what he's saying on is that at some point the gene that supposedly like he said turns on the male parts of the developing female that at one time did not exist, which exactly fits in with what I'm saying, which is that it would first have to evolve. It would first have to invade the female, right? Invade the female, and also find a way to find a way to be able to take over the female as it develops. That's exactly what he's saying here.
At this point, the Y chromosome started to change quite dramatically. Various types of mutations led to a dramatic change of Y chromosomes, making them degenerate really fast, losing approximately 10% of all active genes per million years, basically reducing the number from approximately 1000 active genes to just 27. Here's roughly what it looks like now compared to the
I would actually like to understand the data the information that they have that made them say that it had 1000 genes before, because that just seems really fishy to me, because an infectious organism, right? Infectious organisms are usually small, and the reason is that they depend on another organism to propagate their biological processes, which means that they don't have to be gene heavy, right? They don't have to be gene heavy. They don't have to invest in a lot of genes. They simply have to invest in the genes that take over other organisms. Period. So 1,000 genes seems like it's a lot.
X chromosome. And because of this dramatic loss of genes, it was always assumed that eventually we might actually lose Y chromosome completely. I mean, obviously it has the genes required to make sperm, and even some genes critical for life. If you look at the bigger picture, copies of similar genes exist on the X chromosome as well. It just for the moment, Y seems to do a pretty good job. But one of the main reasons it was so difficult to actually try to read this chromosome, or to try to map it,
with USAA Safe Pilot, I can save when I road trip safely.
Or with USAA Safe Pilot Miles, I can save when I staycation.
is the fact that it's basically full of junk DNA. Nevertheless, the new study
It's basically full of junk DNA, and here is my hypothesis on that. Okay, I actually don't know this for sure, but here's my hypothesis, right? When it invaded the mammals or any organism else that it did to, yeah, it had to do this thing where the way the mammalian things work is that the reason that we are in chromosome is to organize the genes, right? Is to tell you, okay, this is one, so therefore start here and end there, right? This is the middle. This is where you need to be checking. This is where you need to, have your control system, your quality control system here, quality control check there, quality control check there, right? Okay, but and if you look at the genes, the chromosomes, the way they are organized, is that every single chromosome, its pair is identical to it insofar as shape and size, right? So that is how it also checks itself. That is how it checks itself to ensure that it is doing the right things. The shape and the size. Yeah. So when this organism that is the Y, when it invades that, right? The genes, right? The way the quality control system of the organism that is the X would work is that when it sees genes that aren't on this X chromosome, that aren't in a chromosomal format, it would clearly likely see that as some kind of a some kind of like a foreign organism. Okay, it would see that as a foreign organism. So it would discard that. It would raise alarm, and the immune system would probably kick in. So that is why it had to do that's why it had to go into a chromosomal format. Because think about it, the reason it has only 27 genes, and then the rest of it is just junk. It's just like nonsense stuff that isn't doing anything, as far as we know. Yeah, it isn't actually doing anything as far as we know. So out of the God, I forgot how many base pairs that it is, right? Only 27 of them. It only has, supposedly it's like millions of base pairs, right? It only has 27 genes on it, which means that the rest of it is just like what, for show. The rest of it is just for show. I believe it is to trick the X chromosome. I believe it is just, to trick the X, one, first of all, to trick the X chromosome, and two, to trick the quality control system that would be inherent in the organism of the human that the X chromosome represents. Now, the reason it is degenerating, right? I believe that it would have been probably the size of the X chromosome. It would have been the same size of the X chromosome to properly trick it, right? But as it continues to degenerate, right? I think the X has become so used to it that it probably thinks that it is now normal, right? So I think that is what is going on there.
is the fact that it's basically full of junk DNA. Nevertheless, the new study managed to sequence most of it, uncovering that it tends to contain multiple copies of similar Y genes, including genes responsible for sperm generation, and genes responsible for testing it, uncovering that it tends to contain multiple copies of similar Y genes, including genes responsible for sperm generation and genes responsible for testes. But for some reason, some of these genes occur in very strange loops where the sequence seems to be inverted, or strange loops where genetic accidents can sometimes duplicate or even erase genes. In other words, its structure kind of makes very little sense. It's as if it's meant to be somewhat fragile and somewhat easy to mutate and potentially make.
Yeah, because it is an infectious organism, and infectious organisms have to mutate fast because there is such a thing in other organisms, right? In non-infectious organisms as an immune system. You understand that, right? The immune system in organisms, even bacteria, have immune systems. So the immune systems in these organisms, it tracks the infectious organisms. So when an infectious organism invades it, yeah, it takes a bit of their DNA and encodes it into its own to be able to track which one is an infectious organism, so that if it invades again, it will say, okay, in my list of infectious organisms, which one is this? Which one is this one? And then it would know immediately, much more quickly, how to respond to it, right? So they evolved this ability where they are this structure that he's talking about, which is that they are easier to mutate. That it is easier for them to mutate.
Make mistakes. It also contains an enormous amount of structures that contribute to pretty much nothing.
Nothing.
Once again, junk DNA,
yeah.
Where there are quite a lot of highly repetitive sequences that actually seem to be even coming from different viruses or genes that have.
What did I say? I have pegged this as a viral origin organism. Okay, so I'm going to actually end it there because this is getting too long already. We are already at 34 minutes. And again, let's get into the comments and let me know what you think, because I would really like to know that you guys are understanding this stuff. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.